Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon to those of you in Europe. Good morning to those of you who are joining us from the other side of the pond. Welcome to this EPC Unpacking Turkish Foreign Policy webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amanda Paul, and I'm a senior analyst at the EPC and in charge of Turkey, among other things. So welcome. The topic of our discussion this morning is Turkey-US relations. About 1 year ago, we had a webinar on exactly this topic, just after Trump's return to office, when we were trying to predict what would happen in terms of the many issues where Turkey and I was going to say Ukraine there, Turkey and the US cross paths. I can't say that all of the predictions didn't come true. Some of them did, but on some other predictions, for example, the sanctions, the S-400 and whatnot, we still aren't there yet. And these are going to be some of the topics that we are going to be talking to you about today. And I think you're in for a real treat, because we have two of the best experts on the other side of the pond to have this conversation about Turkey-US relations. We have with us Aslı Aydıntaşbaş, who is a fellow at the Brookings institution. Welcome to you, Aslı. It's a really big pleasure to have you with us today.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be here.
Thank you. And we have Nicholas Danforth, who's deputy editor at Foreign Policy magazine, and also a fellow at Century International. Welcome to you, Nick. This is the first time you've been at an EPC event, so it's really a big pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
We also have our audience here. And I would say to the audience at this point, welcome, first of all. But also, as we go through this conversation, please do put your questions already into the box so that our guests here can already start to respond, because there's many things to unpack in this relationship. It's quite a dynamic and multifaceted relationship. But I want to start with maybe the first obvious question, starting with you, Aslı. How would you actually assess the state of Turkey-US relations 1 year into the Trump administration? I mean, are they going great? Do they get along fine? Or is it something in between or worse?
Well, there's no doubt that this started out as a bromance. The Trump administration came into power with a very self-conscious decision to get along with President Erdogan in Turkey. They clearly felt that the Biden administration's more distant approach didn't work for US regional interests. And I think that there was sort of a reflex to do the opposite of what Biden is doing. But for Trump, Turkey was not a new file. He did have an up and down relationship in his first term. So the conclusion was, I want to get along with Turkey. So we've been hearing that, he's basically instructed his bureaucracy not to bring him problems with Turkey. And the result of that was, what we've seen, more of an alignment on Syria and some of the regional issues. There is also an ideological affinity, no doubt. Trump administration's agenda of ending wars, particularly initially in Gaza and later on Ukraine, seemed to fit with Turkey's understanding of what was happening, that it was a good idea to push for this. And also Trump's very personalized diplomacy through envoys and bypassing institutional frameworks and long processes and so on and so forth, just immediately fit with the way of doing business with President Erdogan's inner circle. And it was a seamless adjustment, especially with the arrival of Tom Barak, President Trump's special envoy. Here is where it's not working. And it has not yet resulted in a real meaningful improvement in the problems in the bilateral relations, not taking into account Syria, in which obviously, what happened recently in northern Syria, northeastern Syria, with the rollback of the self-rule experiment, Kurdish self-rule in Syria, is something Turkey has long wanted, and Trump administration does not really seem to care that much about. There's sort of a meeting, there's sort of a meeting of the minds in terms of consolidated, united Syria under Ahmed al-Shara. But aside from that, all these issues that we've been talking about for years, as for hundreds, and CAATSA sanctions, and sort of, Turkey getting a piece of the economic story as in this big geopolitical reshuffling, there has been no movement. I will say that, I think Turks initially welcomed the non-institutional approach and Trump administration's very deliberate decisions to take out democracy and human rights out of this conversation. But because the Trump administration is working in ways that are that are quite outside the norms, outside diplomatic processes, outside of actually institutional frameworks, it is starting to get to be a bit too thin, even for Turkey. In other words, they've been meeting with their counterparts and ending wars in Ukraine, ending wars in Gaza, doing this, doing that, but it's not resulting in a substantial process. And Gaza is a case in example. Board of Peace is an example. Yes, Turkey was initially happy that the Trump administration is moving on Gaza, but it's becoming very clear that the somewhat sloppy and thin and sort of process and with no institutional capacity is not really getting us to a place in which we see an end to the conflict, a transition to phase two with sort of a meaningful political horizon for Palestinians. I think I should stop here and leave it to Nick, but I will say that the particular moment we're in is telling us that Turkey wanted to be on Team Trump, and continues to be on Team Trump. But what we're seeing with the Board of Peace and the sort of the mediagenic element, but without much substance, is, I think, starting to get people realize that in itself is not enough for regional stability and for a greater role for Turkey.
Thank you, Aslı. I mean, that's interesting because in Brussels and in Europe, they quite admire the way that Erdogan seems to have been able to manage and apparently establish very good relations with President Trump. But the way you just described it, it seems to be a relationship that's more in favor of US interests and Turkey perhaps doing what Trump wants rather than Turkey really managing to achieve what it wants to achieve with the Americans to a certain degree. But
on regional issues, there's no doubt this has elevated Turkey's role and visibility and in diplomacy and in regional matters, and people are very happy about what just happened in Syria, no doubt. But moving beyond, particularly taking into account Iran and the ongoing situation in Gaza, I think there is an understanding of the limits of Trump's way of diplomacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I wanted to come to you now, Nick, to get your insights on this in terms of what Turkey has not been able to achieve from Trump. I mean, including vis-a-vis the lifting of sanctions, getting back into the F-35 program, the S-400 issue is still out there. So how would you describe the approach of the Americans towards Turkey?
I guess what I'd say is that it seems like there are two prevailing ideological impulses in the Trump administration. And Turkey is right at the fault line of both of them. Brussels is on the wrong side of both of them. The EU is on the wrong side of both of them, which is why I think there's no reason for the EU to be jealous of how successful Turkey's been in dealing with Trump. I'd say the two prevailing approaches that the Trump administration has to the world, one is a very white Christian nationalist worldview. You saw Marco Rubio lay that out quite effectively at Munich, prioritizes this idea of Western civilization, again, a very white, a very Christian Western civilization. This worldview tends to be very pro-Israel, quite often Islamophobic. And so whatever appeal that may or may not have for certain aspects of the European political spectrum, it's a worldview that Turkey, especially under an Islamist political leader and a very pro-Palestinian political leader, is always going to be on the wrong side of. What's interesting and what's worked out very well for Turkey is that the other prevailing impulse in the Trump administration is very much pro-authoritarian and deeply corrupt. And Turkey's on the right side of this. I don't think the European Union is, and I hope the European Union will stay on the wrong side of this. But for Erdogan, this has been the basis, this has been the ideological and the personal basis of the bromance that Aslı was describing. Erdogan very much does feel like Trump shares his view of the world. Trump feels the same way. They have the same enemies. People like us, the New York Times, the liberal establishments in both countries, the deep state, they very much see themselves as trying to work together in support of at least tearing down the kind of institutional and ideological structure of the transatlantic relationship. And so to the extent that that remains the focus, there is a lot of room for cooperation between Erdogan and Trump. What strikes me, and where I'd say if I went back to my predictions from a year ago where I got things wrong, is that this second impulse has very much carried the day in the Middle East. On Gaza, we actually have seen Trump pushing back more against Israel than we expected. Nowhere near as much as many of us would like. There has been some real pushback. That's carried over to Syria. You have seen you have seen Trump in Washington very much supportive of the Shura government, very much trying to make Syria under Shura work, supporting his efforts to centralize authority, and pushing back and trying to mediate against Israel's impulse to keep Syria weak, keep Syria divided. So Turkey's very much been a beneficiary of that dynamic. In part, I also think this is interesting. Turkey has also realigned its foreign policy in the Middle East. The Gaza war, in many ways, helped Turkey do this. There's been greater alignment between Turkey and a lot of regional Arab countries. You see Turkish-Egyptian ties have improved. More specifically, Turkey-Saudi ties have improved. Turkey-Qatar ties have always been strong. And so Turkey, as Aslı said, Erdogan's always had a close relationship with Trump. They like each other. That's given Turkey a lot of influence. Also, the fact that the Saudis and Qataris have bought off the Trump administration and they tend to be aligned with Turkey on major geopolitical issues, that has been a huge boon to Erdogan. And so, when you get Erdogan, Trump liking Erdogan, and also, getting a jet from the Qataris and also getting God knows what from the Saudis, that creates a situation where he has been much more sympathetic to Turkey's foreign policy perspectives in the Middle East. The limit to that, and we can get into this as it plays out, I know your question was actually about the S-400s and CAATSA sanctions. That carries the day up to a point, but it doesn't, and this is where the incoherence of the Trump administration comes into play. It doesn't necessarily always replace the other impulses. And so you have, at the same time, Trump is pushing back against Israel in very specific areas. He's also happy to give Netanyahu a free hand in a lot of other areas. You see the potential for an upcoming war with Iran as an example of where Trump is very sympathetic to the more ideological anti-Islamist worldview. That's potentially going to result in a situation where, you already have Turkey emerging as Israel's self-declared, new growing main threat in the Middle East. You have a lot of still Israeli anti-Turkish, pro-Israeli, anti-Turkish sentiment in the U.S. Congress, and that, even when Trump wants to do favors for Erdogan, he's also not necessarily committed enough to doing that to come up against the resistance that's going to face in Congress. So when you have issues like CATSA, S-400s, F-35s, where there's a congressional element, that's something where you still have some of these other, you still have the more traditional pro-Israel, often anti-Turkey impulses, political alignments at play.
Okay, so it's not going to be so straightforward to get these CATSA sanctions lifted, as I understand, because there was a statement earlier this year from the foreign minister, Fidan, basically declaring that this was going to happen. But if we're relying on the Congress to do this, it seems less likely, because I'm guessing that President Trump has more important or bigger priorities to cook with the Congress than that. So we shouldn't expect any change either on this or on the S-400 issue.
Yeah, and that's where I do think if Trump decided this was his number one priority and he wanted to jam it through Congress, he probably could. But to your point, exactly, that's not what he's focused on.
But maybe just to come back to a different issue in terms of the relationship between the US and Turkey within the NATO context. I mean, President Trump's position in NATO or US position has significantly changed, to put it mildly. I mean, I think Europeans are going into a meltdown over here, a regular meltdown over the US in general. But how has that impacted the way that Turkey is able to operate within in the NATO context, or its interest within NATO?
So I think Turkey is going through this interesting moment right now in which the bromance with the Trump administration has hit its limits, and there's a new awareness and understanding of the importance of its institutional ties with the West. It doesn't know how to get back to it. It doesn't know how to rekindle the relationship with the European Union. It wants to do so on its own terms, and sort of the roadblocks there are too big. But there is definitely this impulse to once again realize the importance of Turkey's actually institutional anchor to the West, including primarily NATO. So it's no coincidence that the NATO summit is going to be taking place in Ankara. It's no coincidence that we're seeing Turkish officials talk more and more about European security and the sort of role Turkey can play. That is in part driven by an implicit understanding that the disruption has gone from the Trump administration is getting to a bit of a dangerous place. Of course, no one says this publicly, but in reality, I think there is a new desire to once again we go back to the status quo, at least when it comes to Turkey's institutional anchor to the West, primarily NATO. I don't think Turkey wants to see a new European army. I don't think they want to see a replacement for NATO. I don't think they want to see Trump administration destroy NATO. But things might get to that position. So clearly what Turkey needs to do right now is to re-engage with Europe in a more meaningful way, both on defense and on the economic front and on other fronts if it can. But it seems the relationship is so exhausted, so tired, so strained by the past decade, and sort of neither side really know how to do that, at least. But to go back to my point in this whole intervention, what I see is different from a year ago, which is a desire on the part of Turkey to sort of preserve whatever is left of NATO and collective security and collective defense in the transatlantic alliance, not really knowing how it could do that.
Absolutely, Aslı. But Nick, I mean, President Trump has been very clear that Europeans need to do much more for their own security. I mean, in the whole European continent, and is planning, as far as we are aware, to reduce US military presence in the different US bases or operations. I mean, nothing has been 100% clear yet. But in this respect, do you see that Turkey would perhaps be able to fill the gaps that have been left in some of these spaces instead of the US?
Yeah, and that's very much been Turkey's hope. I think Aslı got right to the heart of the two ways, the two angles of looking at the breakdown of the United States' relationship with NATO and the traditional US role in NATO. And going into this, throughout the first Trump term, I think Turkey was very optimistic about how this was going to play out. There was this sense that with Trump abandoning the traditional transatlantic orientation of the United States, it would benefit Turkey on two fronts. Turkey would simultaneously have more room to pursue its relationship with Russia without getting hassled about things like sanctions. And at the same time, as Europe felt weaker, felt abandoned by the United States, Europe would have to double down on its own independent defense capacity and would therefore be more in need of Turkish support and would, as you're describing, come to the conclusion that they needed Turkish participation on Turkey's terms to fill the gaps, maintain the best independent European defense force they could. And I think the passage of time is putting that second assumption under some stress. I don't think, and in part it does depend on how Europe decides to respond to the United States' changing, now increasingly hostile attitude towards Europe. And there are, even within Europe, again, you know this better than I do, a debate between different approaches in looking at Turkey's role. And there certainly have been people, a lot of people from Turkey, some people from Europe, saying that, yeah, Europe's going into a desperate time. They need all the help they can get. That means they can't start worrying about whether Turkey's democratic. They can't start worrying about whether Erdogan's actually pro-Putin. They need Turkish support at all costs. Other approach seems to be, look, the United States is a great ally on paper. The problem when they elect someone like Trump is you have someone who's not actually committed to European security, who's not actually ideologically on board with the European project, who's hostile to democracy, who's actually more pro-Russian than he is pro-European. And so whatever Article 5 commitments the United States still continues to make to NATO on paper, an ally like that isn't actually a very good ally. And the whole project Europe seems like it now has to undergo is how to reformulate its defense so that it's not relying on an ally who's actually anti-democratic and pro-Putin. So the idea that in a similar situation, they would decide, oh, who we really need to help us do that is another ally who's very much anti-democratic, who's hostile to the European project, and who has a soft spot for Putin. Europeans might decide to go that direction. I wish them luck.
But on the other hand as well, it also depends on Turkey's readiness to actually play that role. And the Turkey that we see today is very transactional. I mean, there seems to be this sort of citation from some in Europe that Turkey should deploy. I mean, it's been mentioned a few times, for example, the boots on the ground, even for a so-called assurance force in Ukraine. But that's a different issue. But I mean, Turkey seems to not do anything without getting something in return these days. And it's quite difficult to see what the EU, should say the EU here, would be able to actually give in return, because there's still, as we know, some member states that are actually very opposed to Turkey playing any role whatsoever.
Yeah, so there is an asymmetry in this relationship right now, in terms of the emotions involved. Meaning, I think we hear more and more Turkish officials, Turkish intellectuals coming out and saying, wait a minute, Turkey is exactly what Europe needs right now. Don't you get it? We can produce, we can do a lot in terms of our manufacturing, we can make drones, we can do. I don't see this in Europe. Yes, there is a there's sort of a greater appetite for a more stable and functional relationship, but no one's going around saying, wait a minute, the answer to all our problems is actually Turkey. Why haven't we thought of it? European space is very much the strategic space is very cluttered right now. There is European need for strategic autonomy, defense autonomy. There's the sort of the problem of United States and everything Nick has talked about. There is Russia. There's the ongoing war. There is immediate need. So I don't think the conversation is about Turkey. I don't think Turkey is in the top 5 topics that European leaders and officials and decision makers are dealing with. So that is one problem and part of the asymmetry. The second issue is, of course, the fact that the relationship is still pretty much structured through this accession process, which we all know is dead. But it continues to be the framework. It continues to be the only framework. And you can do things around it. But essentially, those are bits and pieces every now and then. You can have Turkish troops and take part in an exercise in Germany. You can have various things within the NATO framework. But in terms of Turkey's relationship with Europe, the accession process is a straitjacket. It has been for the past couple of years. And how do you move about it? The senior most European official that visited Turkey is being the EU Commissioner for Enlargement. And that is almost a joke in the sense that we all understand that enlargement has become a sort of a problematic issue, a difficult issue, navigating that. And there's a certain amount of hypocrisy around the whole concept. But that European Union decides to engage with Turkey through the enlargement, even though obviously the commissioner is seeking different avenues to maintain the partnership and maybe expand it. Those are all really details and small breadcrumbs, so to speak. So I think the second problem is the fact that the enlargement process is now a straitjacket. Maybe third issue is this is a very tired relationship. Let's not forget that only a couple of years ago the people were sort of hurling let me say, in a more diplomatic way, criticism to one another. With 2016, 17, 18, 20 were really, really exhausting years, to the point that it's become difficult for Turkey and for Europe, but primarily for European leaders to come up with a new language to frame the relationship with Turkey and to cooperate with Turkey. So the tendency is not to touch this because it's become such a toxic European issue for internal. So how do you go about it? There are ways of going about it. Perhaps, if there was a new strategic framework, a new ground bargain, but who has the energy right now in this sort of basically this age of disruption and geopolitical mayhem to come up with a new framework and rebrand the relationship, both in terms of actual outreach to European public, Turkish public, but also in very much in the strategic terms. So those are some of the issues I think we're struggling with in this space.
Thank you, Aslı. Yes, we've been struggling with those issues for many years, and Europe really doesn't have an answer as to how they're really going to progress relations with Turkey. But I want to park that topic for a moment and come back to a more US orientated issue, namely Iran. We've seen President Trump now engaged in some, quite powerful militaristic politics vis-a-vis Iran. I mean, they seem to be ready to launch an attack on Iran. I mean, maybe he will, maybe he won't. Who knows? It's a bit of a guessing game. Turkey, of course, has tried to carry out diplomacy vis-a-vis Iran, but so far nothing seems to have worked. So Nick, I mean, what would be the implications of a US attack on Iran, a strike, however that would take, because it's not clear in what form that strike would take or where they would actually strike, and how would that impact onto the relationship with Turkey? I mean, President Erdogan seems to be showing unprecedented control over his feelings for the moment, but could we see an outburst of anger towards the US if that was to happen?
That's a very difficult and very timely question, and I, with profound apologies, due to some scheduling errors on my part, have to jump off the call for like 10 minutes right now. So I will I will dodge the question in the most literal way possible. Very much hope Aslı can answer that, and we'll hopefully have moved on to easier questions when I'm back in just a few minutes.
Okay,
Apologies.
no worries. I'll see you in a bit.
I'll take the question on Iran. Turkey's position has been very clear from the beginning of this process. They leaned on stability, regional stability, very much hoping to avert US military action. I think this is driven by a number of reflexes, a number of concerns. Obviously fear of instability, the disruption in trade and regional the regional spillover effect, but also migration problems that could come from a US military action in Iran. Secondly, of course, Turkey is a status quo power. It's never wanted, going back decades, it's never wanted US military action, United States to come in and redesign the region. And this has been a controversy even internally inside the Turkish space, even during the first Gulf War and certainly second Gulf War. So I don't think Turkey likes United States, its closest ally, coming in and redesigning its own neighborhood. Thirdly, of course, there is some level of anxiety about what it would mean for the Kurdish issue, given that Iran has a substantial Kurdish population, where you have, also organizations that are considered to be PKK offshoots, very active in the area. They have managed their relationship with the Iranian regime. But what happens if the regime falls? What happens? Would that mean another Kurdish opening, another opportunity for self-governance for Kurds? I think this is always at the back of Turkish decision makers. They never liked what they saw in Syria to the extent, and they are not, even though Iraqi Kurds are Turkey's very close allies, the KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government. I don't, if they could, I think they prefer a unit. They fought independence for the Kurdish regions, and they would prefer a united Iraq. And same understanding here. They are a little bit, they would worry that a major war would mean a new opening for Kurds. And maybe just as important as that, Turkey is very much leading an internal, a regional coalition to make a case to Washington, D.C., to the Trump administration, not to engage in military strikes. There is a sense that an operation, a military operation, does not really have an end game, that it's difficult to actually bring about regime change in Iran through bombing. It's difficult to bring democracy through, sort of a sustained campaign. That Iranian regime is far more resilient than people realize. That if, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is somehow ends up ends up dying after a US strike, then it's going to be the next Ayatollah. If one general is dead, another general fills up. So we don't know if this is the case or not, but I think that Turkey does not want to see, is a little bit concerned about a sustained campaign. Clearly also not wanting the emergence of pro-American, pro-Israeli new regime in Iran, in the sense that increasingly it sees Israel as its primary regional rival. This is true for Israel too. We're now seeing Israeli officials publicly say, even a mention, not just from the government, but now from the opposition too. Naftali Bennett also, has described Turkey as one of the top regional threats. And so in that environment, I think Turkey also worries about the fundamental geopolitical shift in Iran and what it would mean in terms of isolation of Turkey, or more of a sense of Israeli encirclement of Turkey. We have to understand that this is a strange moment in the sense that two of the region's greatest military powers, Turkey and Israel, see each other as a threat, but also think the other side is trying to encircle them. And this is mostly taking place in the space of Syria and Eastern Mediterranean, fighting each other's footprints in that space, but it can easily become a reality in Iran in a war scenario.
I mean, I want to come back to the Eastern Mediterranean and Israel in a moment, but just to stick to Iran, do you think perhaps that President Trump has painted himself into something of a corner? Because there are ongoing negotiations, but I mean, Iranians are also very difficult to negotiate with. They're also good at talking, so there doesn't look like there's going to be, for the moment, a negotiated agreement regarding Iran. I mean, also many of our US allies in the region, I mean, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia and whatnot, are also opposed to a US strike on Iran for different reasons. But President Trump is also not somebody who likes to backtrack. So I am wondering whether he really has put himself into an extremely difficult corner that he will find difficult to come back on, because he has made a number of very strong statements regarding what he's going to do to the Iranians.
There's no doubt that President Trump put himself in a corner on Iran policy, one that he's trying to get out of in some ways, but would prefer to get out of it by doing a symbolic strike on Iran and Iranian facilities and then move on and not have Iranians retaliate. But that does not seem to be in the cards. Iranians are very clearly signaling that they would treat a US strike as sort of as an all-out war, and would respond not just against US targets in the region, but potentially against US allies, with all types of implications about economic disruption and so on. So he's also put himself in a corner in the sense that the administration has been very vague in both articulating the end game here and in actually internally synthesizing and thinking of the end game for US interests. What is the end game in a US strike? If it is regime change, as I mentioned, there is sort of the consensus seems to be that is not something that you can do through a sustained US military campaign. It's possible to weaken the regime or create some sense of instability, but that in US interests. If it is a question of getting them to agree to a nuclear deal, well, the president himself is the one that has tore up JCPOA, the Obama administration's Iran nuclear agreement, which had its weaknesses in terms of the timeline and in terms of not including Iran's missile capabilities, but it also was a structure that worked and was endorsed by the international community and instituted and put in place a number of mechanisms that would have allowed United States to monitor what is happening in Iran. Of course, Iran today has more enriched uranium than it did during JCPOA. So if President Trump ends up exactly in the same place, a sort of a short-term bombing campaign, getting Iranians to the negotiating table and then agreeing to some version of JCPOA, that is going to be, it's going to be the greatest, I think, strategic error of his presidency. Why has he torn up this agreement that kind of worked for Europeans, worked for the region, worked for Iran, and provided a good enough mechanism of controlling Iranian nuclear facilities? And then I think he would have to answer to the policy community if he ends up with a stalemate or a sort of an regional instability. He would have to answer to regional countries. If he ends up signing something that's similar to JCPOA, he'd have to answer to, I think, the policy community and, his congressional allies. If he ends up creating a huge regional mess and long-term instability, I think he's going to have to answer to the American people. So once again, we're here with no clear end game. And to me, it seems what he wants to do is a quick symbolic act with an understanding it would be short-lived, and then can we move on afterwards? But I'm not sure Iranians are willing to give him that, given their own sense of regime's vulnerabilities. They may not play that game a second time. But we will see. I mean, President Trump is very good at creating a bit of a Netflix drama out of every foreign policy option. But, he would take a Venezuela scenario today if that was in the cards, but not everything is in the cards, and this may not end in the way he is hoping it will.
Yeah, and Iran is certainly not Venezuela. It's completely different characters and context and whatnot. But I'm going to leave the Iranian issue there for a moment, because I want to come to the issue of Israel, but also the Eastern Mediterranean. We also have a question about this in the box, and I want to encourage the audience also to put their questions. I mean, in the first place, we've seen a definite doubling down on the relationship with Israel in many ways, which is obviously quite disconcerting for Ankara. But probably worse than that, we've seen a reinforcement of this now partnership between Greece, the Greek Cypriots, and Israel in the Eastern Mediterranean on energy issues. Also a reinforcement of the US position on Cyprus. I mean, their military base there, but also the base, one of the bases that the US has on Greece, none of which seems to be in Turkey's interest. But particularly concerning would be the energy issue and this new partnership that seems to be taking place, and what that means, and how would Turkey, bless you, you deal with it. Maybe this time I'll come to you, Nick, as you're back from your call.
Yes, thank
to
you. I'm
respond
glad
to
I was
this.
able to avoid Iran entirely. So that makes things easier for me. No, I mean it's striking that this alignment between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel has been in the works for a long time. It's been deepening for a long time. It's been driven by energy, but also very much a fear of Turkey. Uh, Turkish foreign policy has played into it in a lot of ways. There was a pretty classic, it seemed like, security dilemma where you had both sides increasingly worried about the other and then doing things. Turkey did a lot of things that I think it thought would help it break out of this perceived encirclement that only ended up reinforcing fears on the part of Israel, the Greek Cypriots, and the Greeks, drawing that network tighter together. What is striking, and I loop back to my original comments about this, when this network originally started to develop, it was not just Greece, Israel, Cyprus. it also brought in Egypt, it also brought in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And there was a much broader configuration of countries that were very much alarmed about Turkey's role in the region. Turkey, I do think effectively, with the help of Israel, managed to peel off the Middle Eastern part of that, the Arab part of that, with the exception of the UAE, obviously, but Saudi Arabia and Egypt certainly. Turkey's both improved relations with them. And again, Israel's very effectively alienated them with its policies in Gaza. And so you now do have a situation where at least the field of countries in opposition to Turkey has narrowed. That said, this alignment does seem to be very solid. Uh, you know, Greece has always seen Turkey as a threat. Israel's dramatic shift into really prioritizing Turkey as a threat is only going to make this relationship tighter, is going to lead to more behind the scenes cooperation between all three countries. That in turn is going to drive more alarm on Turkey's part. Uh, you know, and also further complicating things with the EU because Greece and Cyprus remain members of the EU. This brings in, enlarges the challenge for Turkey. And I think, yeah, creates a situation that in the long run, I, continue to think remains very dangerous. I do, it's good that things have gone as smoothly as they have in Syria to date. For all my criticism of the Trump administration, I continue to believe that their efforts to actually moderate between Turkey and Israel in Syria, try to keep the temperature down there, have been very valuable. Uh, and yet, you have a configuration, you have an alignment uh, between Turkey and some countries that very much see Turkey as a threat that remains whatever. I know we had a positive meeting between Erdogan and Mitsotakis the other day, but it's there will be various efforts to lower the temperature on that. But I think, unfortunately, over the last decade, that the broader alignment has become a very consolidated one, and ultimately is bad for everyone involved.
Thank you, Nick. Asla, how would you see this sort of greater US, engagement, particularly with Greece, and Turkey's efforts to try and balance that out, in addition to the question we have here about ongoing efforts to normalize Turkey-Greek relations. They're all sort of to be mixed up in the same tank now. Turkey obviously wants to have the same level of engagement and support from the US as Greece has. It doesn't seem to me that we're there yet, but are we moving in that direction?
Well, I think a fundamental shift has happened in Greece and in Turkey. And that is in terms of how they see the other. I'm old enough to remember Foreign Minister Papandreou and Greek leadership in the 1990s, which have redefined, re-articulated Greece's priorities in their approach to Turkey and said, it is not in our interests to marginalize Turkey, very much paving the way to Turkish, not just Turkish-Greek rapprochement, but also Turkey's entry into the EU accession process. Along the way, at every step of the way, there were negotiations, but also a Greek push and a strategic decision that Turkey should be in the European Union. Now, I think today Greece does not think that way. I think they fundamentally see regional marginalization of Turkey as a net benefit because of this or that. But, so that is a very big, significant change. And Turkey, it has also changed. Obviously, this is a country that was seeking European vocation, orientation, really valued its EU path forward. Now it is a country with greater self-confidence and a sense that strategic autonomy is its only course, but also that it has a manifest destiny in its own region to be a hegemon. So these obviously two ideas are clashing and will continue to clash. As Nick has said, Turkey or the events that we've seen in the region over the past few years have managed to narrow the scope of this coalition. Now it's down to Greece, Cyprus, Israel, no longer backed by Saudi Arabia, no longer overtly with participation of France and maybe even UAE and so on. But it is still there, and it's still a significant, I think, significant problem both for Turkish policymakers and in terms of their movement in the European space. And, if you look at the accession, even the accession issue, despite its sort of political unfeasibility, it's actually a process that can technically move forward. And at every step of the way, there is sort of the Cyprus issue is what Turkey faces. So even when it wants to have a more diluted relationship with the EU within the existing framework, let's start modernization on customs union type of stuff. Well, what about the ports? What about Cyprus? What about so obviously this is not going to change. My sense is that Trump administration, to the extent that they care about this issue, and they do care much less than previous administrations, but to the extent that they care, they'll try to, one more time, they'll try to see if there is a peace through what some people are calling peace through economic development, peace through economic deals, peace through construction, peace through infrastructure. Like, is there a deal to be made putting energy and energy partnerships on the table and sort of making the case that everything else, including negotiations in Cyprus, UN-led process on Cyprus, is secondary. Can we all make money here? Can we all do business? I don't think it's going to work in this particular instance. I don't think the administration will also have the institutional capacity or bandwidth to put together a package appealing enough to Turks, Cypriots, or Greeks. But I think this is what they're going to try. There's a lot of money to be made here. Why can't we all get along and do some sort of a Cyprus Riviera or Cyprus economic boom plan? It all sounds nice, but they have not been able to achieve, get much traction out of that and out of the PowerPoints and everything they've done in Gaza. So hard for me to see if this will work, but that will probably be their inclination.
Thank you, Aslı. Maybe coming to you, Nick. What way do you see that Turkey could, level up? We always say that in the UK, to level up in terms of the relationship it has with the US as compared to Greece, because there's still a sensation that the relationship that Greece has with the United States is better than the one that Turkey actually has. And is this something that could be addressed or improved in the upcoming NATO summit in Ankara, where President Trump is due to attend?
No, I don't particularly think there is. I think part of what's driving the dynamic right now is that Greece has decided it's going to be the best ally possible. And because it sees Turkey as a threat, it's, for a long time, people in Washington were always very frustrated with Greece. There was deep suspicion of the U.S. relationship in Greece. There was a strong left-wing movement in Greece that didn't like the United States with some good reasons. And that was a major factor in U.S. foreign policy. I remember going to the U.S. Embassy in Greece and asking about some piece of reconstruction that was going on. And they're like, "Oh yeah, that was where someone fired a grenade into the embassy building a little while ago." This was the backdrop. Greece very much, very strategically going back to at least the Obama administration, decided to pivot and decided the way it was going to deal with a lot of geopolitical issues was by being a very eager, enthusiastic U.S. ally. Turkey took the opposite approach. Has very consciously, very assertively pursued an independent foreign policy, has made that, quite central to its identity, has repeatedly referred to its previous approach to the United States, which I never would have characterized as sycophantic or, overly deferential. But Turkish leaders now see Turkey's previous role in NATO as having been, somehow a product of neocolonial submission to the United States, perpetrated by treasonous Turkish leaders. And so, in that context, yeah, it's not, whether you like or don't like U.S. foreign policy, whether you think Turkey's independent foreign policy is justified or not, it's not surprising U.S. leaders are going to tilt towards building up a relationship with Greece that they feel like they'll be able to count on, say in the case of a conflict with Iran, U.S. leaders have, good reason to worry they wouldn't have access to air bases in Turkey. That might be the right decision from Turkey's point of view. Someone who's not thrilled about the prospect of us going to war with Iran, I'd certainly understand why Turkish leaders might say, don't use our air bases for this nonsense. However, at the point where that's a real concern for U.S. policymakers, there's going to be a preference for, again, countries like Cyprus that have traditionally had a long fractious relationship with the United States, but are now trying to be much more cooperative.
Thank you, Nick. We just have a few minutes left, so I want to put one of the questions that we have left in the chat box, which is asking, do you think the Turkish opposition, with their renewed interest in seeking international support for the İmamoğlu case, for those of you that don't know, Mr. İmamoğlu is the leader of the Turkish opposition, and he's been in prison for quite some time now, has been able to create any noticeable change in US-Turkey relations over the past year? Aslı.
I think the answer is a clear no. I think President Trump has made it very clear that he doesn't see Turkey's internal evolution or backsliding as an impediment to relations. He does think of Turkey as a very unique regional partner, one that they could do a lot of business with. So, I mean, in terms of regional issues, so I don't really think that features in the conversation in Washington at all.
Yeah, sad, very sad, but not surprising, to be quite franker. And maybe the last question here, which is in the box because we have like 1 minute, is related to the new potentially the new round of UN-led settlement talks in Cyprus. The person who's asking it, who's anonymous, is saying Turkey does not recognize Cyprus in the UN-led formal settlement talks for resolving the Cyprus issue did not resolve yet. Are you expecting to see a new round of UN-led talks to resolve the Cyprus problem? And maybe an add-on would be, do you see a potential role for the US in that?
Is that for me or Nick?
Whichever one of you wants to comment on that, or maybe you can both have a go at that briefly.
But I think that actually supporting a UN-led process does not seem consistent with the Trump administration's behavior, how they approach these issues. They don't like these lengthy, long-winded processes and roadmaps and so on. And there's nothing more long-winded and detailed than the existing UN framework. I don't see them touching it. I think what they might try is some sort of a peace through business kind of an approach and test it out. But unlike previous U.S. administrations, I think the Trump administration does not feel compelled to solve these frozen conflicts or tackle them and so on and so forth. They'd rather do business with Turkey and do business with Greece. When I say business, I don't mean commercially, but also that, but, bilateral relations without necessarily trying to solve the issue. If somebody presented President Trump a clear set of intentions on the part of Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, that they really are on the brink of a major breakthrough, and this could be added to your list of, the ninth big peace deal you're solving, and that's been for half a century, no one, etc. He would be interested, but I don't see that happening. So just a correction, though, I think, to the question, Turkey does not recognize Cyprus, true, but in the UN-led framework, inside the negotiations, I think they negotiate more as communal entities as opposed to state versus non-state. It is inside the UN room negotiating at the UN negotiating table. There is a formula to overcome that. So that's been the case that they've used for decades. Sorry.
That's correct. I mean, it's the two communities
who knows far more than me on Cyprus.
The two communities negotiate, Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot, with the free external formally guarantors engaged. But that's correct. Do you have a last word on the Cyprus problem, Nick?
Yeah, I'd just say the traditional understanding of solving complex, nuanced conflicts was that it was hard. Cyprus, the perfect example of that. The Trump administration's approach is, what if we pretend it's not hard? We ignore all the complex, nuanced things, and we just pretend to solve the problem. And that's the approach they've used in Ukraine. That's the approach they've used in Gaza. That's the approach they've used in Armenia, Azerbaijan. And what they're finding is, it turns out complex problems are actually complex and peace is hard. And when you just pretend to solve them, that doesn't really work that well. So I think we would see the same pattern play out in Cyprus. And I think that's why, people in Cyprus who've always wanted greater U.S. involvement, I'm not sure now they actually would. I see a lot of people in Cyprus looking at the way Trump's handled their conflicts and being like, I think we're maybe better if Trump's not paying attention to us. And that's a sad sign about the state of U.S. foreign policy right now.
That's correct. But of course, President Trump claims to have solved nine conflicts around the world. So he's a superstar, conflict resolution actor.
Right. And claiming to solve them is very easy if you don't have to actually solve them to do that.
Absolutely, but at least he has the intention to want to resolve them. And on that happy note, we need to draw this discussion to an end. Thank you both. I think it's been fascinating. We've covered so many different parts of Turkish foreign policy, but also Turkey-US relations, all of which actually deserve a webinar by themselves. And also in Brussels, late on a Friday afternoon. So I really appreciate your insights here. I think it was brilliant. I've certainly learned a lot. And I hope that we can have you both back on another occasion to continue these conversations. So thanks again. I wish you a great day in Washington. I should also wish you both luck, actually, as well, for for everything that's going on in the US. That's also the topic for another webinar. And a great weekend ahead of you. So thank you, guys. And thanks to the audience.
Thank you.